There is a moment in almost every narcissistic relationship that the narcissist never imagines will actually happen. They may hear you say, "I'm leaving." They may watch you pack your belongings. They may even experience periods of silence between conversations, but deep inside, they often carry an unshakable belief that you'll come back eventually. Why? Because history has taught them that no matter how many arguments occurred, no matter how many tears were shed, or how many promises were broken, the relationship always seemed to return to the same familiar pattern. They came to depend on that cycle. They expected your compassion to outweigh your exhaustion. They assumed your hope would always be stronger than your disappointment. They believed that your desire for peace would eventually lead you back to them, even if it meant sacrificing your own emotional well-being. This expectation isn't built on genuine confidence in the relationship. Instead, it is often rooted in a pattern of control, where they believe they can predict your reactions because they have seen them before. For a long time, you may have unknowingly reinforced that expectation. Every time you accepted another apology without meaningful change, every time you explained yourself again hoping they would finally understand, every time you gave one more chance because you wanted to believe the best in them, the cycle continued. Your kindness became something they expected rather than appreciated. Your forgiveness became something they relied on rather than respected. Over time, they stopped seeing reconciliation as a gift and started treating it as something guaranteed. In their mind, conflict wasn't something that threatened the relationship because they assumed you would always be the one to repair it. They expected you to return after every disagreement, to soften after every harsh word, and to reopen the door no matter how many times it had been slammed in your face. What they failed to realize was that every painful experience was slowly changing you. Every disappointment was teaching you something. Every broken promise was quietly replacing hope with clarity. One of the greatest misunderstandings in these relationships is the difference between physical presence and emotional departure. Long before someone finally walks away, they often begin leaving emotionally. It happens gradually. The conversations become shorter, the excitement fades, the emotional investment decreases. Not because they no longer care, but because they have become emotionally exhausted. They realize that every discussion ends in blame, every concern is dismissed, and every attempt to improve the relationship somehow becomes another reason to criticize them. At first, they keep trying because they believe love can overcome unhealthy patterns. Then they try because they fear losing the relationship. Eventually, they stop trying because they recognize that no amount of effort can change. Not someone who refuses to take responsibility for their own behavior. By the time they physically leave, they have often been grieving the relationship for months or even years. The narcissist frequently mistakes patience for permanence. They see your willingness to stay through difficult seasons as proof that you will never truly leave. They confuse loyalty with unlimited tolerance. They assume your compassion has no limits because they have rarely experienced consequences for their actions. This false sense of security allows unhealthy behaviors to continue unchecked. They believe they can apologize later, change later, appreciate you later, or make things right someday because they assume there will always be another opportunity. Unfortunately, someday has a way of disappearing without warning. Every relationship has a breaking point, even if that point takes years to reach. No human being can endlessly pour love into a relationship that never returns emotional, safety, respect, and genuine care. What often surprises the narcissist most is not that you left, but that you stayed gone. They expected loneliness to pull you back. They expected guilt to make you question your decision. They expected mutual friends or family members to convince you that everyone deserves another chance. They expected memories of happier moments to overshadow the reality of repeated emotional pain. They assumed time would weaken your resolve instead of strengthening it. What they did not expect was that distance would finally give you something you had been missing for a very long time: perspective. Away from constant criticism, confusion, and emotional pressure, your mind begins to clear. You start recognizing patterns you couldn't see while living inside them. You begin understanding that love should not constantly leave you questioning your worth or apologizing for simply having feelings. As your perspective changes, so does your confidence. The person who once doubted every decision slowly learns to trust themselves again. You begin making choices without seeking permission. You stop measuring your value by someone else's approval. You rediscover interests, friendships, and dreams that slowly disappeared while you were focused on keeping the relationship together. This transformation often happens quietly. There is no dramatic announcement. There is simply a growing peace that replaces constant anxiety. For the first time in a long while, your life begins revolving around healing instead of surviving. That quiet confidence becomes something the narcissist never anticipated, because they assumed your identity would always remain connected to them. Perhaps the greatest surprise for the narcissist is realizing that the emotional hold they once had no longer exists. They may reach out expecting the same emotional response they always received. They may anticipate immediate replies, emotional conversations, or familiar patterns of guilt and reconciliation. Instead, they encounter someone who has changed. Not someone filled with hatred or revenge, but someone who has discovered healthier boundaries and greater self-respect. That difference is powerful because it cannot be manipulated as easily. The person they once controlled through fear, obligation, or emotional confusion now responds from a place of clarity. And clarity changes everything. Once someone truly understands the difference between genuine love and unhealthy control, it becomes much harder to confuse the two again. The reality is that lasting change begins the moment someone stops believing they must return to what continually wounded them. When that realization takes root, the cycle that once seemed impossible to escape finally comes to an end. The narcissist may never have expected permanent distance because they assumed the past would always repeat itself. What they overlooked is that every painful experience was quietly building the courage, wisdom, and strength necessary for someone to choose a different future. The day they realize you are never coming back is often the same day your new life has already begun. Your silence becomes powerful the moment it is no longer an attempt to get someone's attention, but a reflection of your decision to protect your peace. There is a profound difference between silent treatment, which is used to manipulate, and healthy silence, which is chosen to heal. Many people who have been involved with a narcissistic person spend months or even years believing that every problem can be solved by explaining themselves one more time. They rehearse conversations in their minds, carefully choosing words that they hope will finally be understood. They write long messages trying to clarify their intentions. They apologize for things they didn't do simply to keep the peace. They defend themselves against accusations that never should have been made. They keep talking because they believe that if they can just find the right words, the relationship will finally improve. What they often fail to realize is that the issue was never a lack of communication. The issue was a lack of willingness on the other person's part to genuinely listen, take responsibility, and respect what was being said. In unhealthy relationships, every conversation can become another opportunity for confusion instead of clarity. You may bring up a concern, only to find yourself defending something completely unrelated. You may express hurt, only to be told that you're too sensitive. You may explain your feelings, only to have them dismissed, minimized, or turned against you. Gradually, you begin questioning your own perception. You start wondering if you're really asking for too much, if your expectations are unrealistic, or if you are somehow responsible for the constant conflict. This emotional confusion is exhausting because it keeps you trapped in an endless cycle of proving your reality to someone who refuses to acknowledge it. Eventually, you reach a point where you realize that continuing to explain yourself is no longer helping you heal. It is only keeping you connected to the very cycle that continues to drain your emotional energy. Silence in this context is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is recognizing that not every argument deserves your participation. Not every accusation requires your defense. Not every misunderstanding must be corrected. One of the greatest emotional freedoms a person can experience is realizing that their peace is more valuable than winning an argument with someone who has already decided not to understand them. That realization changes everything because it shifts your focus away from convincing another person and toward protecting your own emotional well-being. Instead of spending your energy proving who you are, you begin investing that energy into becoming the healthiest version of yourself. For someone who has relied on constant emotional engagement, your silence can feel unfamiliar. They may have grown accustomed to immediate reactions. They expected lengthy conversations, emotional explanations, repeated apologies, and endless opportunities to pull you back into conflict. They knew which words triggered guilt, which accusations created self-doubt, and which emotional buttons produced the response they wanted. Those patterns became predictable because they had been repeated so many times before. When your responses suddenly disappear, the familiar rhythm is interrupted. The conversations they expected never happen. The emotional reactions they counted on no longer arrive. Instead of finding someone eager to defend themselves, they encounter quiet boundaries that refuse to participate in the same unhealthy cycle. At first, this silence may even feel uncomfortable for you. If you've spent years believing that your responsibility was to keep everyone happy, remaining silent can feel unnatural. You may worry that you're being rude. You may wonder if you're abandoning someone. You may feel guilty for not responding the way you always have. Those feelings are understandable because unhealthy relationships often train people to believe that boundaries are selfish. In reality, healthy boundaries are one of the clearest expressions of self-respect. They communicate that your emotional health matters just as much as anyone else's. They remind you that protecting your peace is not an act of cruelty, but an act of wisdom. There is another reason your silence becomes so powerful. It creates space for your mind to recover. Constant emotional conflict leaves very little room for reflection. When every day is filled with arguments, criticism, or anxiety, your thoughts become consumed by survival. You stop asking what you truly want because you're too busy managing someone else's emotions. The moment the noise begins to fade, something remarkable happens. Your thoughts become clearer. You begin noticing patterns that were difficult to recognize before. You remember conversations differently because you're no longer viewing them through fear or guilt. You begin trusting your own judgment again instead of constantly seeking someone else's approval. Healing often happens in quiet moments. It happens during peaceful mornings when you realize your heart is no longer racing. It happens during ordinary afternoons when you notice you're smiling without forcing it. It happens when you spend time with supportive people who allow you to speak without interrupting, disagree without punishment, and express emotions without criticism. Little by little, your nervous system begins learning what emotional safety actually feels like. You discover that healthy relationships do not require constant tension. You realize that respect feels calm, not confusing. Genuine care brings security rather than fear. These discoveries become possible because silence has given your heart room to breathe again. As your healing continues, your silence changes in another important way. It is no longer simply the absence of communication. It becomes evidence that you no longer need external validation to know your worth. In the past, you may have depended on someone else's approval to feel secure. A compliment lifted your confidence. A criticism destroyed it. Their mood determined your emotional state. Over time, however, healing teaches you to build confidence from within. You begin making decisions based on your values instead of your fears. You stop asking whether someone else approves of your boundaries and start asking whether those boundaries protect your peace. This internal confidence is difficult to shake because it no longer depends on another person's opinion. There may still be moments when the other person reaches out unexpectedly. Sometimes the messages sound kind. Sometimes they sound apologetic. Sometimes they attempt to remind you of happy memories or promise that everything will be different. Sometimes they express anger or accuse you of being selfish. Whatever form these attempts take, your silence allows you to respond thoughtfully rather than emotionally. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. Instead of feeling pressured, you evaluate the situation through the lens of everything you've learned. You remember the patterns instead of becoming distracted by temporary emotions. That pause is powerful because it represents growth. It shows that your decisions are no longer controlled by fear, guilt, or the need to fix someone else's behavior. The greatest strength of your silence is that it redirects your energy toward the one life you truly have the ability to change, your own. Rather than spending every day trying to convince someone else to become kinder, more understanding, or more accountable, you begin asking how you can become healthier, stronger, and more emotionally resilient. You invest in your friendships. You pursue interests that once brought you joy. You develop habits that support your physical and emotional health. You learn that peace is not found by changing another person's heart, but by protecting your own. Every day you remain committed to that peace, your confidence grows a little stronger. Eventually, your silence stops feeling like something you are forcing yourself to maintain. It becomes your new normal, because your life is no longer centered on conflict. The constant need to defend yourself disappears. The pressure to explain every decision fades. The emotional exhaustion that once followed every interaction is gradually replaced by stability and calm. You discover that true strength is not found in having the last word, but in knowing that you no longer need one. When your boundaries remain consistent, your actions align with your values, and your peace becomes more important than returning to familiar dysfunction. Your silence speaks more clearly than any argument ever could. It tells the story of someone who has reclaimed their voice by no longer giving it away where it was never respected in the first place. One of the most confusing moments after leaving a narcissistic relationship is what happens when the narcissist realizes they are no longer in control. Many people expect indifference. They assume the narcissist will simply move on without looking back. Instead, they are often surprised by a sudden change in behavior. A person who once seemed cold may suddenly become affectionate. Someone who ignored your feelings may begin sending emotional messages. A person who refused to apologize may suddenly admit mistakes and promise to become the partner, friend, or family member you always hoped they would be. These dramatic shifts can leave you questioning everything. You may wonder if they have finally changed. You may question whether leaving was the right decision. You may even feel guilty for maintaining your distance. Understanding why these reactions occur is essential because it helps you distinguish genuine growth from attempts to regain influence. For a narcissistic person, control often provides a sense of emotional security. When they believe they can predict your behavior, influence your emotions, or determine whether you stay or leave, they feel confident that the relationship remains within their power. As long as you continue responding to every message, defending yourself against every accusation, or returning after every conflict, they believe the connection still operates according to the same familiar pattern. They may not appreciate your loyalty, but they often expect it. They may not respect your boundaries, but they assume those boundaries will eventually disappear. This expectation becomes part of how they understand the relationship. They come to believe that no matter how difficult things become, they can always restore the previous dynamic simply by waiting long enough or using strategies that have worked before. The situation changes dramatically when they realize those familiar patterns no longer produce the same results. Perhaps you stop responding immediately. Perhaps you no longer argue when criticized. Perhaps you calmly maintain your boundaries without anger or emotional pleading. Maybe you decide to limit contact altogether. These changes send an unexpected message. They reveal that the emotional control they once relied upon is beginning to disappear. For someone who has become accustomed to influencing your decisions, this loss of control can feel deeply unsettling. Rather than accepting your decision with maturity, they may intensify behaviors designed to pull you back into the relationship or reestablish the emotional connection they once controlled. One common reaction is an unexpected display of kindness. They may suddenly become thoughtful, attentive, and generous. They might send heartfelt messages describing how much they miss you. They may remind you of special memories, express gratitude for everything you did, or promise that they finally understand your pain. They may even appear more emotionally vulnerable than ever before. At first glance, these gestures can seem like undeniable evidence that real change has taken place. After all, these are the very behaviors you wished for during the relationship. They are saying the words you long to hear and offering the understanding you desperately wanted. It is natural to feel hopeful when someone appears to recognize the hurt they caused. However, genuine personal growth is rarely measured by emotional intensity alone. Real change requires consistent accountability over time. It involves accepting responsibility without blaming others, respecting boundaries without resentment, and demonstrating healthier behavior even when there is no immediate reward. Lasting transformation is usually quiet, patient, and steady. It does not rely on dramatic declarations or urgent promises. It is revealed through everyday actions repeated consistently over months and years. This is why it is important not to confuse temporary emotional urgency with lasting character development. Someone may sincerely fear losing the relationship, yet still remain unwilling or unable to address the deeper patterns that caused the harm in the first place. If kindness fails to produce the desired response, the emotional tone may change completely. Affection can quickly become anger. The same person who praised you yesterday may criticize you today. They may accuse you of being selfish, unforgiving, or emotionally cold. They may claim that you have abandoned them without reason, or that you never truly cared about the relationship. These accusations can be painful because they distort reality. They ignore the countless opportunities you gave, the conversations you initiated, and the patience you demonstrated over a long period of time. Instead of acknowledging the history that led to your decision, they focus entirely on the present moment, portraying themselves as the victim while overlooking the patterns that caused the separation. Another common reaction involves guilt. They may remind you of everything they have done for you. They may emphasize sacrifices they made or suggest that you owe them another chance because of your shared history. Sometimes they involve mutual friends or family members who encourage reconciliation without fully understanding the relationship's dynamics. These outside voices can create additional pressure because they often see only isolated moments rather than the long-term emotional pattern you experienced. It becomes tempting to question your own judgment, especially if you naturally value forgiveness and compassion. Yet forgiveness does not require abandoning wisdom, and compassion does not require returning to circumstances that repeatedly caused emotional harm. There are also situations where the narcissist attempts to create urgency. They may insist that this is your last opportunity to fix the relationship. They may claim they cannot live without you or suggest that your refusal to return proves you never cared. Urgency is powerful because it encourages emotional decisions instead of thoughtful ones. When people feel pressured, they are more likely to react from guilt, fear, or anxiety rather than clarity. Healthy relationships, however, do not depend on panic or emotional deadlines. They allow space for reflection, respectful communication, and genuine choice. Whenever someone demands immediate reconciliation while dismissing the deeper issues that led to separation, it is wise to slow down and evaluate the situation carefully. Perhaps the most important lesson during this stage is recognizing the difference between being wanted and being respected. Someone can desperately want you back because they miss the role you played in their life. They may miss your emotional support, your patience, your loyalty, or the stability you provided. Missing those benefits, however, is not automatically the same as respecting your needs, your boundaries, or your emotional health. Genuine respect means valuing your well-being even when your choices are disappointing to them. It means accepting that your decision deserves consideration rather than punishment. It means understanding that rebuilding trust requires consistent effort instead of expecting immediate forgiveness simply because they asked for it. As your healing progresses, you begin viewing these reactions differently. Instead of seeing every emotional message as proof of change, you learn to observe patterns over promises. You remember how often similar conversations occurred in the past. You notice whether accountability is consistent or temporary. You ask yourself whether the relationship has truly become healthier or whether familiar cycles are simply presenting themselves in a different form. This perspective protects you because it shifts your attention away from emotional words and toward lasting behavior. Healthy decisions are rarely based on a single conversation. They are based on the entire pattern of someone's character. One of the strongest signs of personal growth is your ability to remain calm while someone else reacts emotionally. You no longer feel responsible for fixing every crisis or soothing every disappointment. You recognize that another person's feelings belong to them, just as your healing belongs to you. You can wish someone well without surrendering your boundaries. You can care about another person's struggles without sacrificing your own emotional safety. You understand that protecting your peace is not an act of cruelty, but an act of wisdom. When you finally reach that place of clarity, the loss of their control no longer feels like the center of the story. Instead, it becomes evidence of how far you have come, how much you have grown, and how firmly you have chosen a life built on respect, honesty, and genuine emotional freedom.